There is a moment, right before everything in your life changes, when you don't even realize you're standing on the edge of it. For me, that moment happened in a restaurant parking lot, watching a man I barely trusted kiss a woman who was supposed to be a stranger to him. I didn't know it yet, but that single moment would lead me somewhere I never imagined, somewhere that involved poison, betrayal, and a truth so much larger than an affair. By the time it was over, I would save my mother's life without her ever knowing it was in danger. But to understand how I got there, you have to understand who we were before any of this started. My name is Olivia Hayes. I'm 27 years old, and I own a regional logistics company that I built from nothing, with no help from my mother's money, because I needed to prove, mostly to myself, that I could be more than just her daughter. That I could be Olivia, not Victoria Hayes' daughter. My mother is Victoria Hayes. If you follow business news at all, you might recognize the name. She built a multi-billion-dollar technology empire from a garage office and a single contract, and over 30 years, she turned it into one of the most respected companies in the country. Forbes has profiled her twice. There's a business school case study built around the year she nearly lost everything and clawed it back in 11 months. To the world, she is brilliant, fearless, untouchable. To me, she has always been something more complicated. Brilliant, yes, but also distant, exacting. The kind of woman who measured love the same way she measured performance reviews, quarterly, conditionally, and always with room for improvement. Growing up, I didn't get bedtime stories. I got strategy. I remember being 11 years old and my mother sitting across from me at the dinner table, asking why I'd only gotten a 94 on a math test instead of telling me she was proud of the 94. I remember learning, very early, that her attention was a thing you earned, not a thing you were simply given because you existed. My father used to soften that. He had this way of stepping between us, of translating her silences into something gentler. When he died of a heart attack when I was 19, that translator disappeared, and my mother and I were left facing each other directly for the first time, with no buffer at all. I want to be honest with you. I know she loves me. I've never doubted that, not really. But our relationship has been strained for years, long before any of what I'm about to tell you happened. And 3 years ago, it became something closer to a fracture, the kind you don't see coming because you're too busy grieving someone else to notice the ground shifting under your own feet. My best friend in the entire world, a woman named Renee, died in a car accident along with her husband. We'd known each other since we were 7. She was the maid of honor I never got to have because I told her years ago she'd be standing up there at my wedding someday, whenever that happened. Instead, I stood at hers. And then, 6 years later, I stood at her funeral, holding the hand of her daughter, who didn't fully understand yet why everyone around her was crying. They left behind a 6-year-old named Maya. There was no extended family able to take her in. Renee's parents had passed years earlier, and her husband's family lived overseas and barely knew the girl. I remember sitting in my car outside the hospital the night it happened, hands shaking on the steering wheel, thinking about Maya somewhere in a county office, becoming a file number, entering a system that swallows children and so rarely gives them back whole. I thought about all the nights Renee and I had stayed up talking about our futures, about the kind of mothers we wanted to be, and I thought about the promise I'd made her, half-jokingly, years before any of this, that if anything ever happened to her, I'd make sure Maya never felt alone in the world. I didn't know that promise would become real so soon. But when it did, I didn't hesitate. I adopted her. No backup plan, no waiting period to decide if I was ready, no thinking about how it would look to anyone. Maya became my daughter in every single way that matters. Not biologically, but in every other sense, she is mine completely and I am hers. That decision is the one that broke what was left between my mother and me. I remember telling Victoria over the phone, 3 days after the funeral, still half in shock myself. There was a long silence on the other end, the kind of silence that, with my mother, was never empty, it was always calculating something. Then she said, very evenly, "Olivia, you understand this isn't a kitten you're bringing home. This is a permanent decision that will follow you for the rest of your life." I told her I understood that completely. That was the point. She didn't congratulate me. She didn't ask about Maya's favorite color, or what grade she'd be starting, or whether she was sleeping at night. She asked about logistics, custody paperwork, whether I'd consulted a lawyer, whether I understood what this would do to my trajectory. That was the word she used. Trajectory. Like I was a quarterly earnings report that had just taken on unexpected risk. Victoria never accepted Maya. Not once, not in 3 years. She told me, more than one occasion, in that calm, clipped tone she uses when she's delivering something cruel and calling a concern, that I was derailing my future by raising a child who wasn't even my blood. I want you to sit with that phrase for a second. Wasn't even my blood. As if love came with a DNA requirement. As if a 6-year-old who had just lost both her parents needed to be evaluated for genetic compatibility before anyone was allowed to love her. At Maya's first birthday with us, my mother sent a gift by courier and didn't come herself, citing a board meeting that, I later learned, had been rescheduled 2 weeks earlier. At her first day of kindergarten, when I sent photos to the family group chat, Victoria liked a photo of my cousin's golf trip in the same 5-minute window and said nothing about Maya's. Small things. Quiet things. The kind of rejection that never announces itself loudly enough to fight, but accumulates anyway, the way water erodes stone. Her prejudice toward Maya, this persistent refusal to treat her as family, became the wall between us. Holidays grew shorter. Phone calls grew colder, more transactional, more about schedules than anything resembling closeness. I kept showing up anyway, because despite everything, I never stopped loving my mother. I just stopped expecting her to make it easy. And then everything changed. Not for me, for her. My mother met a man named Adrian Cole at a corporate celebration her company hosted, marking 25 years since she'd taken it public. He was 29 years old, handsome in that effortless, photographed-well way, charming in conversation, sharp in meetings, the kind of confident that makes a room lean toward him without anyone deciding to do it. He worked inside her company in business development and climbed quickly, too quickly I'd realize much later, in a way that should have raised more questions than it did at the time. Within months, my mother trusted him more than she trusted most people who had been at her side for a decade. I met him for the first time at a dinner my mother organized at her house, 3 weeks after they'd started seeing each other. He shook my hand a little too long, held eye contact a little too steadily, and said, "Your mother talks about you constantly. I feel like I already know you." I remember thinking, even then, that something about the line felt rehearsed. Not wrong, exactly. Just performed. After years of being alone, and I mean truly alone, the kind of alone that comes from building an empire instead of a family, my mother finally seemed happy again. I watched her laugh in a way I hadn't seen since before my father passed. She started leaving the office before 7 instead of 9. She mentioned, almost shyly, that Adrian had taken her to a jazz club downtown, something she would never have considered doing on her own. I wanted, so badly, to be happy for her. Some nights I almost managed it. But something about Adrian bothered me. I want to be clear that I had no evidence.
None.
Just a feeling, low and persistent, the kind you can't explain to anyone without sounding paranoid or jealous. A feeling I tried to ignore, because what daughter wants to be the one who can't let her mother be happy, especially a daughter whose own relationship with that mother had been strained for years already? I told myself I was being unfair. I told myself this was good for her. I told myself a lot of things that, looking back, I only half believed. Their relationship moved fast. Faster than anything I'd seen in my life. Within 5 months, Adrian proposed at a private dinner overlooking the city skyline. My mother showed me the ring the next morning over coffee, practically glowing, and I made myself smile and say it was beautiful because it was, and because I didn't yet have a single fact to justify saying anything else. Within 7 months, they were married in a ceremony that made every business magazine in the country, complete with a string quartet and 400 guests, and a write-up in the Sunday business section calling it the merger no one saw coming. I sat in the front row of that wedding in a pale blue dress my mother had chosen for me without asking, smiling for the cameras, and I wasn't convinced. Not for 1 second. Everyone around her said the same thing, again and again, like a chorus. Victoria Hayes finally found love again. I just kept watching Adrian work the room, charming investor after investor, and thinking that a man genuinely in love doesn't need to be that good at making everyone else fall in love with him too. Then, about 4 months into the marriage, I saw something I wasn't supposed to see. I was downtown for a dinner with a supplier, and as I was leaving the restaurant, I saw Adrian walking in, except he wasn't alone, and he wasn't meeting a colleague. There was a young woman with him, someone I had never seen in my life. And the way they looked at each other told me everything before they even sat down. The way his hand found the small of her back. The way she touched his jaw before they walked through the door. The kiss that followed, right there at the hostess stand, was not a kiss between business partners. It wasn't even the kiss of an affair just beginning. It had the comfort of something old. Something practiced. I stood there in the cold, completely still, and I remember thinking, this isn't new. Whatever this is, it isn't new. I didn't confront him. I didn't call my mother in a panic. I've learned, in business and in life, that confronting someone with a feeling instead of facts gets you nothing but denial and a head start for the person you're accusing. So instead, I made a decision that would consume the next year of my life. I decided to find out exactly who Adrian Cole really was. Using my own money, not my mother's, never my mother's, I hired one of the best private investigation firms in the country, a small agency 2 former federal investigators had started after they got tired of corporate cases that went nowhere. The lead investigator was a woman named Denise Carver, sharp-eyed, unhurried, the kind of person who asked one question and let silence do the rest of the work. I told her I wanted everything. Financial history, prior relationships, current associates, anything that didn't add up. I told myself I was looking for an affair. What they found was something I could never have prepared for. It took 6 weeks before Denise called and asked to meet in person instead of sending a report. That alone told me something. She slid a folder across the table at a coffee shop 2 towns over from where either of us lived, and she said, "Olivia, I need you to read this somewhere private. Not here." I read it in my car in the parking lot, engine off, hands cold on the steering wheel. The woman's name was Sabrina Wells, and she was not simply Adrian's affair. According to the investigators, she had been his partner, his real partner, for nearly 8 years. Years before he ever walked into my mother's company. There were photographs in that folder of the 2 of them on a beach somewhere tropical, for years earlier, looking every bit like a couple building a life together. There was a lease agreement with both their names on it, an apartment they'd quietly kept even after Adrian moved into my mother's house. Years before my mother ever knew his name, Sabrina had already known everything about her. Even worse, Sabrina had known about my mother from the very beginning. Not as a rival, as a target. The investigators pieced together, slowly and methodically, that Adrian and Sabrina had planned this entire relationship together. My mother's loneliness after my father's death. The timing of Adrian's hire at her company, which Denise discovered had been preceded by 3 months of him quietly researching Victoria Hayes online, attending the same charity gala she attended every spring, positioning himself in rooms he had no professional reason to be in. The careful, deliberate courtship that followed. None of it had been an accident. None of it had been love. It had been engineered, step by step, by 2 people who had done this kind of thing before in smaller ways on smaller targets. Denise found at least one prior relationship of Adrian's, a wealthy widow in another state, that had ended abruptly and strangely 2 years before he ever met my mother, until they found someone worth the risk of going this big. But I still couldn't answer the one question that mattered most. Why would a 29-year-old man marry a 46-year-old billionaire he didn't love, knowing the world would call it obvious, knowing her own daughter would be suspicious from day one? I told Denise to keep digging. I needed the why. I had no idea the why would terrify me more than anything I'd uncovered so far. It was around that time that my mother started getting sick. At first, it was subtle. The kind of subtle you explain away. Fatigue that she blamed on overworking. A little weight loss that she credited to a new diet. Small memory lapses, forgetting a name in a meeting, repeating a question she'd just asked. Dizziness she laughed off as low blood pressure. Then came the fainting spells. The confusion that would creep in by late afternoon and clear by morning. The weakness in her hands that made her drop a coffee cup twice in 1 week, something I had never once seen happen to Victoria Hayes in 27 years. Doctor after doctor blamed stress, exhaustion, the pressure of running a company that size. And on paper, that explanation made sense. But my instincts, the same instincts that told me something was wrong about Adrian the very first time I met him, were screaming now. Something was terribly wrong, and it wasn't stress. Then the investigators sent me something that changed the entire shape of what I thought I was dealing with. They had recovered messages between Adrian and Sabrina. I want to be careful here because what I read made my hands shake so badly, I had to set my phone down twice before I could finish. The messages weren't about an affair anymore. They were about my mother's symptoms, about timing, about how long something might take before it became irreversible, in their words, about what would happen to her assets once it was over. I sat in my kitchen at 11 o'clock at night and finally understood what I was looking at. My mother's husband wasn't planning to divorce her for her money. He was planning to let her die for it, slowly, in a way no doctor would ever question. The investigation that followed confirmed the worst of it. Adrian had been quietly introducing something harmful into the supplements and vitamins my mother took every single day, almost like clockwork, the same bottle she trusted, sitting on the same shelf at her bathroom, handled by the one person she trusted enough to never check. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a single dose meant to be discovered. It was a slow decline, engineered to look exactly like aging, exactly like stress, exactly like nothing at all. A death that would arrive quietly enough that no one would ever think to ask a single question. I remember sitting with that knowledge for almost 2 full days before I told another living soul.
I didn't sleep either night.
I kept picturing my mother at her bathroom counter, swallowing those pills every morning the way she'd done for years, completely unaware, completely trusting. Because once I said it out loud, it became real, and once it was real, I had to decide what kind of daughter I was going to be. The next morning, my mother called me, just to talk, the way she'd started doing more often since the wedding. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, listening to her voice, tired, a little slower than usual, complaining mildly about a headache that probably just needed coffee, and having to bite down the urge to scream into the phone that nothing about this was normal, that someone in her own house was killing her one vitamin at a time. I told her to feel better and to call her doctor if it didn't pass. I hung up and sat with my phone in my lap for 10 minutes before I could move. I decided I wasn't going to be the daughter who panicked. I was going to be the daughter who fixed it. Without telling my mother, because at that point, I genuinely didn't know if telling her was safe, didn't know who else might be involved, didn't know how Adrian might react if he felt cornered, and didn't know whether grief and fear might push her to do something rash that would only put her in more danger. I quietly assembled a team. Private investigators to keep building the case. Medical specialists who understood exactly what we were dealing with and how to treat it discreetly, without alerting anyone in her household. Forensic experts who could turn suspicion into documented, irrefutable proof. And attorneys, because I already knew that whatever happened next would eventually have to survive a courtroom, not just a confrontation. Working with the doctors, we found a way into her home that didn't raise suspicion. A housekeeper named Rosa, who had worked for our family for 15 years, who had known me since I was a teenager, and who trusted me completely the moment I sat her down and told her, as gently as I could, what we believed was happening. Rosa cried when I told her. Then she asked me what she needed to do. Slowly, carefully, every supplement and vitamin my mother consumed was replaced with a harmless equivalent. Same bottles, same labels, same routine. Nothing in her daily life appeared to change at all. Meanwhile, her doctors began treating her, discreetly, under the explanation of preventive blood work and a new wellness program, for the exposure she'd already had. There was one moment about 3 weeks into this, when I almost lost everything. Adrian came home early one afternoon while Rosa was mid-swap in the bathroom, an empty supplement bottle still in her hand. She told me later her heart nearly stopped. She managed to say she was cleaning the cabinet, that one of the bottles had spilled, and he barely glanced at her before walking past toward his office. It was that close. One bad afternoon, one extra question, and the entire plan could have collapsed before it even had a chance to work. Because we caught it early enough, most of the damage was reversible. Over the following weeks, my mother began feeling stronger, sharper. The fog lifted from her memory. The dizziness faded. The headaches stopped. And the entire time, she had no idea what had actually been happening to her, or what had just stopped. I want you to imagine that for a second. Imagine quietly saving your mother's life, while she believes she simply caught a lucky break with her health. Imagine sitting across from her at dinner, watching her thank Adrian for taking such good care of her, for making her slow down and rest more, while you know exactly what he had been doing to her for months, and you have to smile and pass the bread and say nothing at all. That was my life for the better part of a year. I went to work. I picked Maya up from school. I made dinner, helped with homework, tucked her in at night, and then I sat at my own kitchen table reviewing surveillance reports and financial documents until 2 a.m, building a case against a man who had no idea he was being watched at all. While my mother recovered, the investigation continued in the background. Months of evidence, videos, audio recordings, messages, financial records that traced, dollar by dollar, exactly how Adrian and Sabrina intended to divide my mother's fortune the moment she was gone, down to which properties Sabrina wanted and which accounts Adrian had already begun quietly restructuring in anticipation. It was meticulous. It was patient. And it was, in its own twisted way, almost impressive, the amount of restraint two people could show while waiting for someone to die. I knew I couldn't confront Adrian privately. A private confrontation gives a guilty man room to maneuver, to deny, to disappear, to destroy evidence, to simply divorce her quietly and vanish with whatever he could still take. I needed something bigger, something undeniable, something that would happen in front of enough witnesses that there would be no version of events except the true one. The opportunity came when my mother's company announced she would be receiving a prestigious Lifetime Achievement Award at one of the most important business events of the year. The entire corporate elite would be there. Investors, board members, executives from companies across the industry, national media, cameras, live coverage. It was, without question, the single moment in her life when the most people who respected her would be in one room at the same time. It was the only stage big enough for what needed to happen. I remember standing backstage that night, watching my mother in her seat near the front, radiant in a way I hadn't seen in years, completely unaware that the man holding her hand had spent the last year planning her death. Adrian sat beside her, smiling for photographs, playing the devoted husband flawlessly, right up until the moment her name was called and she walked up to receive the award of a lifetime. That's when I asked to speak. I watched the confusion ripple through the room as I walked onto that stage. Victoria Hayes' daughter, the one who rarely showed up to these things, suddenly standing at the podium beside her mother. My mother turned to me, smiling, assuming I was there to say something proud and sentimental for the cameras. I wasn't. I started by introducing Sabrina Wells to a room full of people who had never heard her name. I explained, slowly and clearly, that she had been in a relationship with Adrian for nearly 8 years, long before he ever met my mother. I watched the first wave of confusion cross faces in the crowd, watched my mother's hand slowly slip out of Adrian's. Then I went further. I explained that their entire relationship, the courtship, the marriage, every tender moment that had convinced an entire company my mother had finally found happiness had been planned from the very beginning. Not love. A long con, built around her loneliness and her fortune. The room had gone completely silent by then. I could see Adrian's expression shifting in real time, that practiced charm cracking at the edges as he realized this wasn't an accusation he could smooth over with a smile. Finally, I told them the part that mattered most. I explained that for months, someone in that very room had been slowly poisoning my mother through the supplements she trusted every single day. I presented the evidence as I spoke. Messages, financial records, the timeline our investigators had built piece by piece, the motive laid out in black and white for everyone to see. And then came the detail that broke the room wide open. I revealed that Adrian believed, up until that very moment, that he had been poisoning my mother successfully for months. In reality, every single supplement in her home had been quietly replaced almost from the start. He hadn't been killing her. He had been documenting his own guilt, message by message, day after day, while a team I'd assembled watched every step of it happen, completely unaware that he was under surveillance the entire time. I will never forget the sound of that ballroom. Hundreds of the most powerful people in the industry, completely silent, staring at a man who had just realized, in real time, that he'd spent a year building an airtight case against himself. Security had already been quietly informed before the event began. Police officers who had been waiting outside, ready, stepped into that ballroom and arrested both Adrian and Sabrina in front of the entire business world, the cameras that had been there to celebrate my mother's career instead capturing the unraveling of the man who had nearly ended her life. I looked at my mother as it happened. She wasn't crying. She wasn't screaming. She just stood there, very still, staring at the man she had trusted enough to marry, finally understanding what almost happened to her. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of both our lives. My mother needed time to process not just the betrayal, but the fear underneath it, the knowledge that she had been dying quietly in her own home and hadn't known it, that the person closest to her had been the one doing it. Recovering from that takes more than medicine. It takes rebuilding trust in your own judgment, which I think, for someone like my mother, was almost harder than the poisoning itself. But something happened during that recovery that neither of us expected. Maya never stopped showing up. Despite years of being dismissed by Victoria, despite never once being called a granddaughter, despite every quiet rejection a 6-year-old shouldn't have had to absorb, Maya visited my mother's house almost every week during her recovery. She brought drawings she'd made at school, flowers she'd picked from our own backyard, little handwritten letters, the kind with uneven handwriting and hearts drawn in the margins. She asked for nothing in return. She wasn't trying to win anyone over. She was just being exactly who she'd always been, kind, without condition, without keeping score. I remember the day my mother called me, her voice different than I'd ever heard it. She told me she'd been sitting on her porch when Maya showed up uninvited with a drawing of the three of us, labeled in crayon. My family. My mother said she had to excuse herself to the bathroom so Maya wouldn't see her cry. That was the moment, I think, when my mother finally understood something it had taken her an entire lifetime, a near-death experience, and the unconditional patience of a child to learn. Family was never about blood. It was never about appearances or backgrounds, or the things she'd spent her whole life measuring people by. It was about who shows up, who keeps showing up, even when they get nothing back. A few weeks later, my mother asked Maya and me to come over for dinner. Nothing formal, no announcement, just the three of us at her kitchen table for the first time in years. Near the end of the night, she reached across the table, took Maya's small hand in hers, and apologized, not just to her, but to me, for every year she'd spent treating love like something that had to be earned through bloodline instead of given freely through presence. I won't pretend that one dinner repaired everything. It didn't. We are still healing, all three of us, in different ways and at different speeds. But for the first time in my entire life, my mother looks at Maya the way I always hoped she would, not as an obligation, not as a complication, but as her granddaughter. Because that's exactly what she is. If there's one thing I learned through all of this, it's that the people who are supposed to protect us aren't always the ones who actually do. Sometimes protection comes from the daughter who refuses to let her mother die without a fight. Sometimes it comes from a 6-year-old who shows up with crayon drawings and asks for nothing at all. And sometimes, the family you build with love ends up being stronger than the family you were born into ever was. If this story moved you, take a moment today to think about the people in your life who show up for you without being asked to, and let them know it matters. And if Olivia and Maya's story stayed with you, share it with someone who might need the reminder that family isn't about blood. It's about who stays. Thank you for spending this time with me.